What makes an equalizer parametric is its ability to control the frequency band that you're cutting or boosting, or emphasizing or de-emphasizing. And that control is the third in the list. Right now, the low-mid equalizer is set to parametric 2. And let me show you what happens when you adjust this. But in order to see it, we're going to have to turn up some of the gain. So let's bring up 6 dB of gain in the 800 Hz frequency range, and then press play on our Cubase project. When you adjust the Q factor of the equalizer, what you're going to be doing is narrowing that bandwidth, or widening the bandwidth. When the bandwidth is wide, you're going to be adjusting EQ across more instrumentation. And when you narrow the EQ, you're going to make it much more selective. And what I mean by selective is, with a narrow bandwidth, you're going to be able to pick certain things out of the mix. For example, there's that side stick, the sound of the stick on the snare drum rim. So I'm going to bring the gain of that equalizer up, and with the bandwidth set to a very narrow range, we're going to be able to pick that out of the mix. There it is. We can really hear that side stick now. Let's hear it before and after. And that's too extreme, but by using extremes, we're able to find what frequencies and instruments we want to cut or boost. So let's bring that down to a more manageable level by turning down the gain. And maybe not make it so narrow. Still a little too obvious for my ear. Let's bring it down to about 4 dB. Here it is without. And there it is with. So if I wanted to hear more of that side stick, I could narrow the frequency range and then turn the gain up. But it's also important to note that you don't always want to turn things up. Again, sometimes you want to turn things down to de-emphasize them. So let's cut the gain in the opposite direction. I'm going to go ahead and press play. Right now we can hear it. Let me cut the volume of that frequency band down to about 4.7 below 0. Now we can hardly hear that at all. We can hear it a little bit when the equalizer is off. We can hear it a lot if the equalizer's gain was turned up. And we hear much less of it when we turn the gain down. So that's what the Q factor control does on a parametric EQ, and that's the way that the low mids and high mids of the Cubase channel EQ work. But it's also important to note that there are other types of EQ curves. If we turn on all of the frequencies, on the low frequencies and the high frequencies, there are a lot of different types of Q factor to choose from. The default is low shelf 2, and high shelf 2 on the high frequencies. When you're using a shelving EQ, like the high shelf or the low shelf, essentially they are just treble and bass controls with selectable frequencies. So just like we learned about how an equalizer works on a car stereo with preset bands, like at 100 Hz and 10,000 Hz, you can now control what sort of curve you're using for the shelving EQ. So let's go ahead and reduce some gain of the low frequencies, and then change the Q factor of that shelving EQ. You can see that now, with the bandwidth pulled really far apart, we're affecting a lot of low frequencies across that spectrum, but the spectrum goes off the scale. That's what a shelving EQ does. It goes off of the scale of the full range, whether it's on the low end or the high end of the frequency spectrum. So if I were to adjust the high shelf frequency bandwidth wider on the treble frequencies and then take away some gain, see how it goes off the scale? If I add it, it goes off the scale but on the top end. So that's a shelving EQ. You can still make it wider or narrower, but just be aware that it's going to be going off the screen, but since your ear can't hear it, it's not going to make much of a difference anyway. Now let's learn about the two different ways that you can manipulate an EQ's controls.